Yes, yeah, it's perfect.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thank you to Nabila, who's been a joy to work with, and to the Museum of Surrey for inviting me for this talk. I was hoping I could see people's faces as I'm talking, but that's okay. I'll just pretend you're all smiling along with me. I did time myself before starting today, and my talk is only about 30 minutes long, which I'm okay with because I do like to have more conversation and Q&A at the end. I often find in these really meaningful conversations, the questions get missed and the dialogue in the end. So apologies if the presentation's not as long as maybe you had hoped, but that maybe means we can have more dialogue towards the end. So I want to begin also by acknowledging that I speak from the territory of the Stalo people, the people of the river. I'm grateful to be able to work on these lands and continue to advocate in solidarity with Indigenous sisters and brothers. And in particular, I remind people listening that the TRC calls to action says that in terms of museums, in Call 67, that quote, "We call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museums Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make recommendations," end quote. I urge all museums across Canada and here in British Columbia to hold the CMA accountable to do this work, especially when the CMA's leadership and board does not hold the level of diversity and depth that is needed to enact the Call 67. We as museum professionals and organizations have a responsibility to hold each other accountable rather than pandering to powerful and problematic organizations. For those who know me, they know that I will not hold back when I present. And part of this not holding back is my recently found philosophy driving the anti-racist work that I do. And that philosophy is that if I'm not making you feel uncomfortable in addressing the range of privileges you have working within the museum sector, then I'm not speaking truth to power. Part of feeling that discomfort, that feeling of unsettlement that so many of us Indigenous Black people of color feel every minute of every day, is going to be the empathetic shift you need to make in this sector and field. So do get ready to feel some discomfort as a pathway to becoming anti-racist advocates. Do be ready to give space to others in doing so. My presentation today is picking up on the heels of much of the activism and work that I've been engaged in this past year. This work has become more and more critical, more and more pertinent, more and more honest, and I'm sure more and more uncomfortable for some of you to hear. So my talk today will offer some tangible action items that I encourage you to do as a pathway and movement towards anti-racism. I realize that not everyone listening to me today is necessarily a museum professional, and so I encourage you to think how what I say today can be transferred within your institutions, your workspaces, or your living spaces. Much of what I have to say is indeed transferable. I will continue to use the platforms that I'm privileged to be on in order to continue to push people's performances in the museum sector. And unfortunately, that's all that is still continuing, performances. I have very sadly not seen enough transformative anti-racist action taking place, and it certainly isn't radical enough for me yet. Many of you still continue to do what Sarah Ahmed defines as, quote, tick box approaches to diversity, where institutions can show that they are following procedures, but are not really behind them. So showing can be a way of not committing. Yet even if commitment is posed as an alternative to the paper trail of diversity, it remains elusive and difficult to define. According to Bernadette T. Lynch and Samuel J. M. Alberti, in their article Legacies of Prejudice, Racism, Co-Production, and Radical Trust in the Museum, quote, these encounters, so performance or encounters between racialized people and white museum professionals, still resonate with the museum's role in essentializing difference. Western institutions continue to maintain borders and to privilege particular ways of knowing. Consciously or not, those who staff museums and galleries have been trained and socialized to think and know in those ways. And museums are not set apart from global economic injustice and the reality of racial conflict and prejudice. Fanon in 1952 warned that we should not disregard the long-term pathologizing effects of colonialism on the colonizer. And yet, the museum adopts a benevolent position while the community member becomes the beneficiary. Have we yet escaped the colonialist way of thinking and operating? Can we discern traces of institutionalized racism in even the most well-meaning of organizations? In his article, A Museum Sector in Crisis, author and museum professional Armando Perlo said the following, quote, "Soon after the killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, museums joined institutions around the world making public statements of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Most of the statements from museums were not backed up by a track record of anti-racist work. Many were, in fact, covering up a culture of human rights abuses and discrimination that has plagued these institutions for far too long. Current and former museum employees, artists, and communities called out institutions for creating an environment where racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and other forms of oppression did harm. In Canada, several organizations have been exposed for their abuses and lack of BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color representation. So the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the Art Gallery of Mississauga, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Vancouver Art Gallery, Contemporary Calgary, the Royal Alberta Museum, the Gardner Museum, and Lakeshore Artists. Parallel to the public fall of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights for its abuses against BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and women, former AGM employees also tried to hold the gallery accountable. They received an outpouring of support on Instagram when the institution tried to label their activism as a smear campaign. In support of BLM, a group of 7 Asian American women artists publicly canceled an event at the Vancouver Art Gallery due to the lack of Black representation at its board and executive levels. The event was rescheduled to take place at Contemporary Calgary, but the women pulled out days later after citing similar issues there. In Quebec, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts is embroiled in controversy surrounding the firing of its former director and chief curator Nathalie Bondel. Almost a month after her departure, an open letter signed by almost 100 current and former employees affirmed that she created a toxic environment rife with intimidation and psychological harassment. As we all know very well, British Columbia is not immune to the shedding light of racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and continuing systems of oppression in museum spaces. What I really need for you all to understand is that this isn't an RBCM issue only. It is your museum issue. It is your museum's organization issue, including the BC Museums Association, whose executive refused to say the words "We believe Lucy" back in September of 2020 when Lucy's story first broke, because apparently belief cannot be corroborated. And so I will not join the chorus of accolades being given to the BCMA now that they finally issued a statement addressing Jack Lohman's resigning. That statement has unfortunately come many months too late and is exactly the part of the problem that I'll be talking about today. Furthermore, after a talk I'd given for the BC Museums Association in June of 2020, I received notes from colleagues in Alberta who told me that their museum affiliates in Alberta had made comments along the lines of, well, it appears to be that racism is a British Columbian issue only, and that our museums don't have the same issues. But I'd like for you to know as well that you do. And if your response to what's happening around you is to negate your own or your organization's ongoing complicity, I truly urge you to reconsider and self-reflect first. Indeed, museums are still not neutral spaces to work from. They are not neutral spaces for those of us who have historically not belonged. To suddenly begin feeling like we do belong just because your intention is trying to make us belong. Intention isn't good enough. Museums still continue to be spaces where power is enacted. Museums still continue to be spaces where meaningful and long-standing relationships with a range of BIPOC communities are often not being made beyond a one-off temporary exhibit. Museums still continue to be spaces where protocols and bureaucracies take precedence over actual humanity and change. Museums still continue to be spaces where BIPOC professionals on the ground are not believed and are not listened to. Museums and museum organizations continue to perform, and not act. And so, what are some meaningful ways that you as museum professionals can move beyond intention and good vibes and thoughts to meaningful action to change your spaces and to become spaces of cultural belonging? Let's start with some of the don'ts. My list of don'ts are: don't frantically and artificially create community partnerships so you can add another checkbox for show. Don't think that every BIPOC moment you see around you is a moment to capitalize on for your museum when you haven't built the community connections and foundations to engage in that work. Don't be a museum diversity performer. So this includes the black squares, the empty statements, the lectures, and the webinars. Don't expect quick results. In a Features magazine article titled "A Crisis of Whiteness in Canada's Art Museums," Sasha Suda, director and CEO of the National Gallery of Canada in 2016, said, quote, "What it means specifically to be an anti-racist institution. We're not serving all Canadians equally right now. We can't find ourselves in this space and wonder how we got here. We have to name and find the source of the symptom and make sure this doesn't keep happening." End quote. And that was in 2016. The need for art and all other museums to serve all Canadians also includes an imperative to pull away from narratives based on white-centeredness and seeking empathy from the white gaze and mostly white visitors. This sort of sterility comes from museums shaping narratives that are whitewashed, and even when difficult histories are forged, they are forged by often white curators, leaders, and archivists through their gaze. This often leads to museums actually reinforcing violence towards its own BIPOC staff and subsequently visitors, both of which are a small number to begin with. One where, quote, "The most dangerous outcome of this all-white leadership is not irrelevance. It's the reflexive perpetuation of violence and harm toward the people they marginalize. Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, people with disabilities, 2S LGBTQIA+ people, which has impacted the health and creative capacity of countless artists, staff, and future leaders whose bodies don't reflect whiteness back to itself." End quote. In terms of the frantic desperation for BIPOC community partnerships, it's so important that you all understand that affect comes from the relationships that are forged in the museum world. The relationships with BIPOC communities who have historically been told they don't belong in your spaces. The shift from not belonging to belonging from BIPOC by BIPOC as a pathway to anti-racism is the affect. It's what I've seen in my PhD research at both the Sikh Heritage Museum and the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center. And so the heart of the museum project is not collections. It is not displaying the other anymore. It is the forging of relationships with BIPOC. Relationships where we are listened to, where we are heard, where we are hired, and we are supported. If you attempt to do anything different, you will not succeed as an anti-racist organization. You can continue to organize your talks, you can do your social media posts, you can do your temporary exhibits, but that foundation will never be forged. So shift from thinking about things to relationships. Relationship building is predicated in the idea of trust. And trust between racialized communities, between professionals and those who are being invited to the museum space, has the capacity to be stronger based on shared experiences of not belonging. Once again, scholars Bernadette T. Lynch and Samuel J. M. argue that creating radical trust is critical to museum work to subvert institutional racism, a trust in which the museum may control neither the product nor the process. The authors describe museums as contact zones that should be places not only for collaboration, but also for contestation. Different participants bring diverse interpretations and agendas that are not homogenized into a seamless product, but they rather remain distinct. The role and capacity for relationship building through this radical trust concept is something that is easily negotiated by those from within their own communities. It's a strength that BIPOC professionals bring into these museum spaces. Another Canadian scholar, Timothy Stanley, suggests that the nationalist grand narrative, he takes this in part from Benedict Anderson's theory of imagined communities, is recurrently giving voice to a particular interpretation of the past and reified through forms of public memory, including the museum. Inclusion into a, quote, Canadian identity fortifies tropes of white settler colonial histories, almost always histories that are not particularly good history. Any attempt to create multicultural or diverse inclusive histories, so by discussing, for example, Chinese Canadian histories or Black histories as a one-off, leads to, quote, symbolic ghettoization. This line of argument is the very same for when museums create temporary exhibits that are diverse. They are in fact not diverse and only add to the centering of whiteness in museums, as well as fortifying structures of wrong histories. The reimagining, then, is not going to be achieved through temporary exhibits and through the creation of diverse advisory committees or EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion training to an almost all-white staff. Rather, the radical change I advocate for within the reshaping of public memory is completely decentering white experiences from the production of history in these museums. I'm calling for a radical transformation in the way museum exhibits are created. I'm calling for a radical transformation that does not reinforce the grand narrative of Canadian history, one that follows the progress of the European frontier. Is this concept really as radical as it needs to be, though? I also want to note regarding one of my points about don't expect quick results. This has to become a moment where, from this point onwards, you are creating a pathway to becoming anti-racist organizations. And if the heart of your anti-racist museum is going to be relationships, you must understand those relationships are coming from a place of distrust at some level. So the trust has to be built over time. So you cannot expect quick results into a process that has been centuries in the making. It's going to take time, but I assure you, the moment you start working from a centeredness of relationships first, the synergy will bring people into your spaces. The synergy will bring the hires into your spaces that you want. That synergy will happen, I promise you. So let's talk about some of the tangible do's. Do create an urgent task advisory to do a systems review of your entire museum, asking the following questions. How many BIPOC community partnerships and engagements do you have? Are they meaningful and how so? So I'm hoping you understand what I mean by meaningful at this point and not performative. There's a huge difference between the two. Really assess who are your community partnerships, how do you engage with them, how often, and that through that process you'll understand whether it's a meaningful relationship. How many non-white voices do you have in all your permanent exhibits? In the images, in the text panels, in the narratives? And one thing I would add here is even just marketing of your museum space, right? Communications and marketing has a huge role to play in what you output in terms of what people think is in the inside of your museum. And so if you're outputting a homogeneous understanding of who visits your museum, that's who you're going to get entering your museum, right? So marketing and communications is very important here. Do assess your hiring practices and modes of platforms used to find diverse hires. And once again, I revert back to my comment about building relationships. Once you start building those relationships, the comments of they aren't applying, whoever that they is, will shift and change. The reason why they don't apply into your museum spaces is because you haven't shown that you can make the meaningful relationships, right? So that they can come in and feel like there's a space there for them, whoever the them is. Do be accountable to your communities and have tangible goals and timelines of what we can expect to change. I think part of the frustration so many of us BIPOC are feeling about the museum sector is that there is work being done in the background, right? But we as your community, we as your stakeholders want to know what you're doing, like with transparency and with honesty. So give us your accountability register, give us your timeline, and it's okay if you don't meet those timelines. But I think you owe it to your communities to give us some sense of how long, what will that be, how will you engage in those processes. That is part of that relationship trust building where your community begins to see that there is a pathway to trust taking place. This do may not seem important, but it really is perhaps the most important. Do learn the history of the foundation of the museum project. Why does this matter? How does colonialism intersect? Question the Enlightenment as a model for success. Have philosophical discussions, and I mean within your staff, right? Within your community spaces, amongst colleagues. Devote time. If monthly is too much, given all that everybody is dealing with, make it every 6 months, right? Have a philosophical conversation about your purpose and why it matters as it relates to the foundations of how you came to be as an organization. The foundations of the museum was an Enlightenment project based on forging the categories of who belonged as the voyeur in those spaces and who was the voyeurized. So i.e. who belonged and who didn't. It's so important to look at how the museum, upon its formal beginnings, was a space and place of not belonging for everyone other than white people. As argued by Sarah Ahmed, the quote, very labor of transforming institutions is how we learn about institutions as formations. The museum project, in its foundations, is one of a project of whiteness and colonialism. To transform the museum as a process of colonialism is to first learn how the museum forged categories of racial separation. In this way, Linda Tuhiway's Smith's call to hold alternative histories as a means to hold alternative knowledges is an important tool to be used within the museum context to reshape its style, function, and systems of being. This is, of course, no easy task. Do question your bureaucracy and board structures. Are they trained on anti-oppression on a consistent basis? So not just during Black History Month as part of yet another performance. Do they have experience in working with BIPOC and on EDI initiatives? How much power do they have, and how much power do they actually need? What I found is that many of these board structures, especially if you look at municipal museums, are based on membership of families that have earned privilege and wealth as a part of the very colonial systems you're trying to question. And so it's really important that those people give space for different perspectives in those board spaces. So, you know, the other question is how much power you give to board structures. A lot of the time, the barriers to change in your museum spaces around anti-racism is always relegated to the wall or the wall of resistance being from the board or being from structures that are similar to board setups. You have to question why it always ends up being that you face those barriers to change right at the board setting. So if you preempt that by changing the way your board is structured as a part of the process of an anti-racist institution, that's part of that holistic process of changing how your museum functions. Who is in your board? What training do they have? What meaningful understanding do they engage with in terms of, anti-oppressive training? So that's very important to question. And finally, do prove Ames Césaire wrong. Ames Césaire said in 1950 in his book, Discourse on Colonialism, quote, "It would have been better not to have needed them. That Europe would have done better to tolerate the non-European civilization at its side, leaving them alive, dynamic, and prosperous, whole and not mutilated. That it would have been better to let them develop and fulfill themselves than to present for our admiration, duly labeled, their dead and scattered parts. The museum by itself is nothing, it means nothing, it can say nothing, when smug self-satisfaction rots the eyes, when a secret contempt for others withers the heart, when racism, admitted or not, dries up sympathy." Prove Ames Césaire wrong. I truly believe that there are so many conversations taking place in the BC context that I'm aware of, that it is very much possible to prove this quote wrong. But the fact that Ames Césaire in 1950 is speaking to some of the issues that we're still addressing in 2021 shows me that it's not happening fast enough. And it really shows me that people aren't being bold enough. We're not holding each other accountable enough. We're not saying the things that need to be said in the public setting because we fear repercussion, right? It often ends up being people of color who are putting themselves out there, losing their jobs, losing their power, losing their credibility in many ways by speaking out. And it shouldn't be that way. And I think